In this video, I'm going to analyse the movements that occur at the shoulder girdle and joint, elbow and radial ulnar joint whilst removing a jumper. I have broken down the movements into 4 phases. Phase 1 raising the arms, Phase 2 gripping the jumper, Phase 3 extending the elbows, and Phase 4 bringing the arms down. I will describe what movements occur at each joint in each phase. In the sagittal plane, the frontal plane and the transverse plane. Throughout these phases, all movements in the sagittal plane rotate around the frontal axes, movements in the frontal plane rotate around the sagittal axes, and movements in the transverse plane rotate around the longitudinal axes. The base of support remains constant throughout the movement as the person remains on 2 feet. There are changes in friction, centre of mass, and line of gravity as the jumper is removed. Inertia is overcome and momentum is gained. In the starting position, the model's 2 feet is their base of support, with their centre of mass central within the base of support. The shoulder joint and shoulder girdle are in their normal anatomical position, the elbow is neutral, and there's roughly 90 degrees of pronation at the radial ulnar joint, resulting in the palms facing the body. This remains constant throughout. In phase 1, the model is raising the arms to reach for the jumper. In the sagittal plane around the frontal axis, there is roughly 90 degrees of elbow flexion, which is caused by the concentric contraction of the 3 primary flexor muscles of the elbow, which are the biceps brachii, the brachioradialis, and the brachialis. The bicep is the agonist and the triceps is the antagonist. Whilst the agonist contracts, causing the movement to occur, the antagonist typically relaxes so as not to impede the agonist. This moves the radius and ulna towards the humerus. The muscles work against gravity, overcoming inertia and gains momentum. In the transverse plane around the longitudinal axis, there is roughly 45 degrees of medial rotation of the shoulder joint due to the concentric contraction of the anterior fibers of the deltoid, pectoralis major, latimus dorsi, teres major, and subscapularis, which are innervated by the C6 nerve. At the same time, there is no movement in the frontal plane. Here, the body is working against gravity as the arms are moving upwards. The centre of mass and line of gravity would shift slightly, but still within the base of support, so the model remains balanced. In phase 2, in the sagittal plane, there is roughly 100 to 110 degrees of shoulder flexion due to the concentric contraction of the pectoralis major, which is the prime mover, the anterior deltoid, and the coracobrachialis, which moves the humerus towards the clavicle. At the same time, still in the sagittal plane, there is greater elbow flexion to around 120 degrees, which is then maintained due to the isometric contraction of the elbow extensors against gravity. To allow the person to hold on to the jumper, there is also isometric contraction of the wrists, flexors, and extensors, so that the wrist remains in slight flexion in the sagittal plane. In the frontal plane, there is concentric contraction of the supraspinatus, all deltoid fibers, and pectoralis major to slightly abduct the shoulder. Simultaneously, the trapezius and serratus anterior concentrically contracts to laterally rotate the scapula in the shoulder girdle. There is no movement in the transverse plane. Away from the shoulder and the elbow, there is flexion at the neck and spine due to the contraction of the obliques, rectus abdominis, and the sternocleidomastoid. During this phase, there is friction between the body and the jumper, which is overcome by contraction of the muscles mentioned. And as the arms are raised, the centre of mass will also move upward, but still maintaining balance. In phase 3, to remove the jumper, the elbows fully extend in the sagittal plane due to the concentric contraction of the prime mover of elbow extension, which is the triceps brachii muscle, and it is assisted by the much smaller anacanus muscle. The biceps eccentrically contract. The wrist flexors and extensors remain in isometric contraction, keeping the wrist in slight extension to keep hold of the jumper. Meanwhile, in the frontal plane, the shoulder starts to adduct in the shoulder girdle, caused primarily by the pectoralis major, latimus dorsi, teres major, triceps, and coracobrachialis. This allows the jumper to be pulled overhead. In the transverse plane, the shoulders remain slightly medially rotated due to the isometric contraction of the anterior fibers of the deltoid, pectoralis major, latimus dorsi, teres major, and subscapularis. Away from the arm and shoulder, there is neck and trunk flexion, which aids removal of the jumper. This causes a noticeable change in the centre of mass, which moves forwards, causing the line of gravity to lie outside of the base of support. There is also increased friction as the jumper is pulled over the body, however here the movement is with gravity. Finally, in phase 4, in the sagittal plane, there is approximately 100 degrees of shoulder extension at the glenohumeral joint, back to the neutral position, initially due to the concentric contraction of the posterior deltoids, teres major, and latimus dorsi, working with gravity. Then it becomes an eccentric contraction to stop the arms from continuing to swing due to the momentum. Full elbow extension remains due to the continued isometric contraction of the triceps and biceps, allowing the arm to remain straightened. Wrist flexors remain slightly flexed in order to hold onto the jumper. In the transverse plane, the shoulders remain slightly medially rotated due to the isometric contraction of the anterior fibers of the deltoid, pectoralis major, latimus dorsi, teres major, and subscapularis. The radial ulnar joint remains in slight pronation. Finally, away from the named joints, the neck and spine extend due to contraction of the posterior muscles. Again, this movement is aided with gravity, and as the person returns to the starting position, the centre of gravity moves backwards and the line of gravity returns to being inside the base of support. In the finished position, the shoulder joint and the shoulder girdle are back in their normal anatomical position. The elbow is neutral and there's roughly 90 degrees of pronation at the radial ulnar joint, resulting in the palms facing the body. The model centre of mass is central within their base of support. The biomechanical principles of this movement are: there's friction between the model's jumper and shirt and the body, gravity is involved, inertia has to be overcome to initiate the movement. Despite the changing centre of mass, the line of gravity remains within the base of support throughout.